اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله سيدنا محمد وصحبه وبارك وسلم. To Islamic Forum, Awqaf and Beit al-Khidmah and honored guests here this evening, Assalamu alaikum. It's certainly quite impressive to see so many people coming out on a Friday evening to listen to some old guy talking about a book. It's quite impressive and quite touching, so I'd like to thank all of you for making the effort to fight through the traffic and the potholes to get here. It's appreciated. Where do I start? It's quite an interesting question, because if I were to really start from the beginning here, I'd have to go back hundreds of years to the beginnings of modern day colonialism to talk and to explain about the situation in the Cape or Cape Town that led to 182 orang kaya or nobility of Indonesia being sent to the Cape in political exile from 1668 until 1795. But let's give some background to the story that I've tried to tell. Just to preface it by saying that when people ask me what was the process of the book, how did I do it, I say it was oral, it was anecdotal, experiential, and then it was archival. And as a historian, or as a journalist stroke historian, you have to deal with many dotted lines and fill in many dotted lines to understand and to interpret history. But just a quick word, one of the archival sources is sitting here, Professor Salaman Dangle, who is one of the pioneers into the research of the life of Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar. And so many of us have followed in his footsteps after the great work that he did in unearthing something about the life and times of Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar. So we thank him for that. I think he needs to be acknowledged for that. So let's get back into history and the story of South Africa from a colonial viewpoint. In the 1600s, Europe was starting to wake up. Not wake up in the most positive of senses, because what was happening, the Portuguese and the Spanish had been roving in the seas and basically acting as colonial pirates. But in the 1600s, the Dutch started to gain ascendancy of the seas, and they started spreading their wings, and a company called the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, Verenigde Oosterlijke Company, and my Dutch is very bad, was founded as a corporate entity by the state. It had a management of 17 people called the Heren 17 or something. Now what is interesting about this is that they used a colonial model that we see even occurring today in the developing world, where I've got gunpowder, or I might have nuclear power, so I'm superior to you in every single way. So I will come to your country, I will occupy you, I will take your resources, and if you resist, I'll beat the hell out of you. This colonial model we can see applying quite graphically in places like Iran, and even in Palestine, which is a colonial project that has gone to extremely dire straits. I don't know how many people realize, just to quickly as a footnote, that Gaza has potential gas resources. And one of the reasons for trying to conduct ethnic cleansing is to clear the land so they can get the gas. But that's another talk, another day. So what happened is that the Dutch arrived in Southeast Asia. We must be very careful with our geographical terminology. I do not like the term Middle East, and I don't like the terms Far East, because what is it Far East of? There you go. It's east of Europe. Middle East, middle of what? Greenwich Mean Time. Where does it come from? So I'd rather call the Middle East West Asia and the Indonesian archipelago and India Southeast Asia. It's a safer terminology and it's geographically correct. So what happens is the Dutch arrive and parts of the Indian coastline, Coromandel, Malabar coastline, Ceylon, and the Indonesian islands of Sumatra and Java in particular are their targets. Sumatra and Java are resource wealthy. There's gold, ceramics, fabrics, and more importantly of all, there's cloves and there's pepper, which in those days had a huge currency. So the Dutch moved into this region to basically plunder. Obviously this was met with opposition, and we need to understand that Indonesia was a country of culture. Don't forget that it was a place of civilization. And if you go to Indonesia, you go to the jungles of Sumatra and Java, you will see ruins there that are thousands of years old and built by people with great intelligence, not by somebody in Europe, while Baghdad had running water and street lamps when people in Europe couldn't even write their names. So Indonesia starts being plundered, but there's opposition, because most of the coastal areas of Sumatra and Java are sultanates. And of course, Islam does not meet with the approval of the Dutch and the sheikhs, the advisors in the Sultan's courts, the Sufi sheikhs, whose values were straight down the line for them. Their supreme master was Allah, Almighty, and not a colonial overlord, because some of the sultans capitulated or tried to bargain with the Dutch, which was fatal. So they sacrificed their souls on the altar of expediency, whereas the Muslim leaders were not prepared to do this. As a result, a lot of these shuyukh became something of political hot potatoes. So the decision was made to exile them to the furthest points of the known world. And at that stage, it was Cape Town, called Cape of Good Hope, which was a term coined by the Portuguese when they used to go around Cape Town, because mariners and sailors were very scared of rounding the Cape, especially after Francois de Almeida got slaughtered by the Khoisan when the Portuguese tried to capture and kidnap some Khoi children about 100 years before even the Dutch came to create their watering point. So in 1652, I'm going to do a lot of historical jumping around, Jan van Riebeeck arrives. Interesting asides about this man, he was as corrupt as hell. And he'd been caught in Vietnam, where he was a governor, stealing from the company, which everybody did in those days, so times haven't changed. And he was sent home, and on his way home, he spent some time at the Cape. And he was very impressed with the Cape, and he went back to Amsterdam and he convinced the people there that the company must establish a watering point in Cape Town. But this is also a very colonial kind of act, because Achamau, the Khoi leader, for more than 20 years had been supplying water and meat to the passing ships. And before him, other Khoi leaders had been doing exactly the same thing. So why did the Dutch not to agree? Why didn't they trade with the Khoi? Open question. When Van Riebeeck arrived, he's a pretty nasty character. And he was so ugly that the Rand notes that used to have his face on is not his face. They've got a guy called Johannes van Vermeuren, and they put his face on instead of Jan van Riebeeck. So colonialism can be a bit of a joke sometimes. But nonetheless, on a more serious note, life at the Cape became very grim, because in about 1658, after that, the slaves started to arrive, because the Dutch East India Company was not allowed to enslave the local population, and the Khoi were not into it anyway. They were a bit too busy fighting the Dutch and resisting, so they would not have subjected themselves to slavery in any case. Who would? So the slaves started arriving to help the watering point at the Cape. Where did the slaves come from? This is quite interesting. There's been a lot of studies on it, but the latest sort of information I've managed to get is that 50% of them were of African origin, including from Madagascar. So where did the slaves come from? The first batch of slaves came from West Africa, we believe from Guinea. Then slaves also came from the Swahili coast. And information that I saw just the other day seems to point out to an interesting thing, that even some of the isiZulu were part of the slaves that were sent to the Cape, or captured. They used to call them in the Cape Musbekers, Mozambicans, but Mozambicans basically meant East African slaves. And then of course from Indonesia and from India. So the slaves came from all over the place. So they arrived at the Cape, 62,000 of them from 1668 until 1795. So what was it like if you were a slave? Number one, let's say your name was Yusuf and you come from Batavia, then your name would have been Yusuf from Batavia, your indigenous name. You come to Cape Town, your name would become Johannes February, because you were sold in the month of February, or bought in the month of February, and the slave masters and the Dutch were too lazy to pronounce Arabic names. So Yusuf or Yunus would become Johannes or Jan, or they would also use the names of Greek gods and names from the Bible to insult these people. So it was a thoroughly degrading experience. You lose your name and you lose your identity. Above that, there was something called the Tilbach Code. And the Tilbach Code said that you could not wear shoes. Now in Cape Town it gets cold in winter and there's lots of water about. So imagine having to wade through ice cold puddles, muddy puddles in the middle of winter. And Cape Town was a very dirty city in those days. So you could be walking barefoot through sewage. That's what the slaves were subjected to. They couldn't ride in a horse cart as a passenger. They couldn't ride on a horse. They had to carry a pass. The Tompas had a very early start in South Africa, and they had to be inside by 10 o'clock at night. If they went out after dark, if they didn't carry a lantern, they could get whipped. There's just so many rules that were against them in terms of being a human being. Punishment was extremely severe. I'll give you the example of somebody called September van Boogies. Even to this day, we do not know what the name of this man was. But he was a healer from Sulawesi, who in the 1700s issued some azimuts, which is like, I don't know what the word we use here in Durban, it's like tawiz. He issued some tawiz to some escaped slaves, and he gave them some food. He was a shepherd at a place called Bloberg, which is out across Table Bay, and he helped these slaves who'd escaped. The slaves were caught, and most of them were killed, and one of them on his sort of deathbed said, yeah, September van Boogies. The colonialists went to where he was working as a shepherd, and they opened his trunk and they found a document written in Boegenese script. And they said this was a letter of sedition. This was a letter between the people saying that they were going to rise up against the company. It was a total lie. It was a letter from another person in Stellenbosch complaining to September van Boogies his health was bad. Could September van Boogies send him a tawiz or an azimut? For that, he is taken to the castle in Cape Town and tortured. But he doesn't utter a word. He does not give up his the people, the slaves around him. He doesn't confess. So what the colonials do, they put him on a wheel, which is a wooden circle, and they tie him on it, and they break his bones with an iron bar. I can put it on there, right? Can radar you microphone junkies. So what they would do, they beat him on his bones until they broke. But what is interesting, and this absolutely amazed the Dutch, is that he didn't say anything. Not one word when they were beating him. And the only thing he would say was, La ilaha illallah. And he's left to die on the wheel in the burning Cape sun. So that's just a very brutal and graphic example of how it was in those days if you were the underclass, if you were a person of color. Now into this atmosphere, into this society are injected these Sufi sheikhs. People like Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, one of the greatest alims of his time, a man who studied the deen for 26 years, 40 different ijazas in tasawwuf, also an expert in fiqh, in Shafi, and I believe Hanbali fiqh as well. People are discovering that. And such an important character that when he was exiled to Ceylon, and he was exiled 3 times, from Makassar to Batavia, from Batavia to Ceylon, and Ceylon to the Cape, that the Mughal emperor Aurangzeb told the Dutch to keep their hands off Sheikh Yusuf. He said, Sheikh Yusuf is our sheikh. Aurangzeb was ruling 150 million subjects in India. And Sheikh Yusuf had become very well known to the sheikhs in India who were beginning to call for his release. And the Dutch got very nervous and they put him on a ship and sent him to Cape Town in 1694. One of the greatest islands in Southeast Asia, who was such a great sheikh, he was allowed to lecture in the haram in Makkah, and they used to call him, I think, Tuan Jawi, or the Jawi Sheikh. Imam Abdullah bin Alawi al-Haddad, the composer of the Ratib al-Haddad, which is very popular at the Cape, traveled with Sheikh Yusuf, apparently on Hajj. This is the latest information. But nonetheless, in the city of Taiz in Yemen, Sheikh Yusuf is recorded as having read certain chapters or a book of Ibn al-Arabi to Imam al-Haddad, who was actually blind. And Imam al-Haddad records this. So this is the caliber and the character of these people. On top of that, Sheikh Yusuf was a Sayyid. His father, if you look at his full kunya or agnomen, has got part of his title, I think is Al-Hadrami Al-Alawi, which tells us from Hadramaut of the Ba'alawi, which indicates from Hadramaut, Sayyid. So Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar was a descendant of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what did these sheikhs do for the slaves? Time and time again, the sheikhs and the imams would tell this very diverse community, you are a prisoner in the dunya, but in the akhirah, you will be set free. And there's one imam who testified to the British when they came to the Cape in about, I think it was called the Cold Brick Commission in about 1836, I'm not too sure, on slavery, where the imam actually mentions this. He said, this is sometimes all we could tell the people. But these sheikhs were not going to take things lying down. So their way of resistance was very clever, because if they lifted a sword, the Dutch would kill them immediately. So they encouraged the slaves to run away. And some of these shuyukh themselves escaped into the mountains surrounding Cape Town and created these communities, these circles. And that's why you will find, if you visit Cape Town, that these sheikhs are buried close to water, because that's where they could take their wudu, get water to drink, to cook with, and also some of them are by the sea, Indonesians are fishermen, so they could get nice galjoen out of the ocean, and they could have food. There were also extensive networks into the city. The shepherds would go into the country areas or into the peninsula and bring them rice and food, and the refugees in the bush would cut firewood and give them firewood in exchange. So there was this whole network. The other interesting thing is that a lot of these kramats are on the old Khoi cattle trails. And I'm fighting quite strongly for an awareness of this, because there are certain historians who seem to think that this cannot be the case. I mean, how would the early sheikhs have known where to go in the mountains? Who were the people who knew the mountains the best? Khoi, without a doubt. They'd been living there for a couple of thousand years. They might know their way around. So you'll find people like Sheikh Nurul Mubin. And there's some such beautiful stories about how these people got to where they got to. The story that I've been told for so many years, from when I was very young even to now, is that Sheikh Nurul Mubin, I mean, we don't really know who he is. That he was in prison on Robben Island, and one day he got tired, so he drew a door on his cell, walked through the door and on the water to land. Now, what is interesting in Indonesia, a lot of the hikayat, the historical myth, talks about a lot of the original shuyukh in Indonesia being able to walk on water. I can't say whether it happened or not, I wasn't there, obviously. And there's a possibility he could have swum from Robben Island, but whatever the fact is, very few people were able to escape off Robben Island. But this man ends up there, up the mountain, teaching a circle of murids. And you'll find Tuan Jafar, Odekrab on the Khoi Trail, Hazrat Sahibshi up the mountain along the Khoi Trail, Sayyid Ali Basir on the same trail. And this is going through beautiful, well, white suburbs basically, and up the mountain. Tuan Jafar, all of these shuyukh buried on these trails. Constantia, Sheikh Abdul Matalib, Sayyid Mahmoud Al-Aidul Rus, Sheikh Abdul Rahman Matebi Shah. They were sent into the forests of Constantia. How did they get there? The Dutch used the Khoi Trail to get to the forests. So it's very interesting to see this interplay. How did they resist? And this is interesting. And the best example I can give is of Tuan Guru, who arrives in 1780. Imam Abdullah bin Qadi Abdul Salam, who himself is another descendant of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And as a footnote, I have managed to identify 7 figures buried in the soil of Cape Town who we can quite safely say were descendants of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And I keep on repeating it like a stuck record, but it kind of adds a bit of a glitter to the soil of the Cape. It kind of adds, I think, to whatever barakah there might be there. And talking about barakah, why is it the circle of the saints? Tuan Guru, before his death, and this is reported by one of his descendants to the Cape Times, reports his grandfather or great-grandfather saying the following to the people of Cape Town: "My dear brothers and sisters, serve your masters, for one day you will be free, and you will be protected by a circle of kramats from fire, pestilence, and famine." Which gives us proof that already in the 18th and 19th centuries, that our people knew about this awliyāʼ in the soil, probably from the earliest days. For example, the Easter festival at Sheikh Yusuf's grave has been taking place for more than 200 years, for example. So how did Tuan Guru resist? He was clever. He arrives in Robben Island in 1780 because the Dutch had lost his papers. It was on another ship that was still at sea, so they said, "Who are you?" "This Jane." Okay, that's pretty not what they said, but they sent him off to Robben Island, and Tuan Guru records this in a letter that he sent home. He spends about a year there before he comes off the island, because the Dutch were invaded by the British, and he's sent again back onto the island in 1786. But in the interim, he writes a Quran from memory. Now, as I keep on saying, in South Africa we have beautiful Hufaz. People like Sheikh Ismail Lant, who I believe is coming to Durban one of these days, for example, most beautiful of voices, melodious. But if you ask them to write the Quran, with all respect, they can't do it. But Tuan Guru was not only a Hafiz, he was a calligrapher. He was also a Qadi. And he was a Sufi Sheikh as well. All of this in one man, which is what our awliyāʼ are, actually. The reason he writes out the Quran is because he believes he can liberate the souls of the slaves through the Quran. Of course, the Quran is the most liberating document in the universe. And he feels that by teaching people Quran, he's going to give them back their dignity. He also writes another book called the Marifah. We call it that, but it hasn't got a title, in which he lays out Tawheed. He talks about the various adhkar, the dhikrs that people must make. For example, the Hizb al-Bahr, Hizb al-Wiqaya of Ibn Arabi, Hizb al-Bahr of Imam Shadili. And these are all adhkars that can be used against oppressors. So you can see a pattern emerging. He's teaching the slaves how to strengthen their souls, strengthen themselves against the existence which they are leading, the miserable existences that they're leading. In 1793, he has the courage to open a madrasa. And what is interesting about this madrasa, at the time of Tuan Guru's death, there were more people at his madrasa than there were at SACS, or South African College Schools, which is going to become University of Cape Town. His madrasa was bigger than that. But where it was successful, it was inclusive. It didn't matter who you were. You could come to his school and you could learn. And because of this inclusive ethos of the early Cape sheikhs, people started becoming Muslim over and over again. And this, of course, is also not helped by the Dutch, who actually encouraged a lot of their slaves to become Muslim, because then they could be sold. If a slave became Christian, difficult to sell a Christian slave. So again, the Dutch by default were making sure that Islam was on the rise. And there's so many lessons from the time, the years of Tuan Guru and this early shuyukh. The whole ethos is what South Africa should have done when they were alive. Because remember, we are the victims of 300 years of colonialism, and then the double whammy, 46 years of apartheid, which is colonialism on steroids. And that's a lot to absorb for any people, any nation. And we've kind of done quite well as a community. I'm not denying we do not have problems. But the fact that in any gathering, in any mosque in South Africa, you will see the faces of every single nation of the earth. It's because Islam is inclusive, and these sheikhs embodied this spirit. And they were so successful that by the 1850s, I came across a population survey done by the British, which revealed that 48% of the faith-practicing community in Cape Town was Muslim. I don't know what's happened since then, but that certainly is illustrative of the success of these early sheikhs and these imams, fighting against great odds. I mean, the Statute of India said, if you propagated any other faith other than the Dutch Reformed one, the ultimate punishment could be execution. So it wasn't easy, and this is why you find Cape Town Islam particularly starting off on the periphery of the city, and then slowly moving into the center of the city when people like Tuan Said Alawi arrives in 1744, and Tuan Guru specifically arrives in 1780. These guys were courageous. In 1797, Tuan Guru is becoming absolutely infuriated because he wants to establish a mosque, and the local government keeps on doing a Zuma on him. They just don't want to respond. So He says, okay, I'm going to show you something. In 1797, he goes to the quarry of the Boerkamp and he holds up open at Jumma. In Afrikaans we say, het 'n vuil plak gehad. That is courageous. And the British just looked the other way. I thought, no, they just looked the other way. And then after that, he was allowed to establish the mosque in 1804 when the British declared freedom of religion, not because they were liberal, but because they needed allies to fight the Dutch, because the British came in after 1795 and lived in fear of the Dutch trying to get the Cape back. And that's another story, another rabbit hole. I'm not going to talk about that part of our history. I mean, I can carry on talking for so long. These people were so courageous. Sayyid Mahmoud al-Aydurus, another sad story. They have a rebellion in central Sumatra against the Dutch. The Dutch wanted to take over the port of Padang in central Sumatra for themselves. Now these shuyukh came from Aceh, which is the west of Sumatra, and the Sultanate of Aceh was really very angry that the Dutch were starting to undermine them. And there was an uprising in central Java, just north of Padang, and 3 sheikhs were captured. Sayyid Mahmoud, Shah Abdul Muttalib, we believe, might have been amongst them, but the 3, it was Sayyid Mahmoud, Shah Abdul Rahim al-Tabi Shah, and another man. And the Cape governor, 3 days after they've arrived, says 3 Malay priests arrived here, very dangerous people. We kept them in chains. We've sent 2 to the forest and 1 is in Robben Island, and we are going to keep them in chains. Terrible people. We do not even know the name of the man who went to Robben Island. Can you believe it? We cannot find his name in the archives, cannot find it anywhere. Unknown, buried on the island, because we believe that that person died on Robben Island. I can carry on talking forever and forever. I don't know whether this could be a Q&A. I'll try and be the A part of the Q if it's possible. But thank you for listening so far. It's a topic that's close to my heart and I can carry on forever, but I'm not going to carry on forever. Thank you.
Jazakallah khairan, Brother Shafiq, for that fascinating insight. Just a little, aspect of what's in the book, which I'm sure most of you will acquire and start reading. It's really a fascinating read. So we're going to start off the evening first with a not a rebuttal, but what's the word I'm looking for? Respondent, yeah. Responded by Dr. Hafiz Muhammad Amin, who has spent a lot of time in the Cape and who I asked about a week ago to be the respondent, and he kindly has agreed. So I'll call upon Hafiz Dr. Muhammad Amin. He promises not to make us sleep because he's an anesthetist.
That was my joke. What am I going to say now? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah. First of all, hearty congratulations to OCAP South Africa and to Brother Shafiq Morton. One gets the impression when reading this book, especially in Brother Shafiq's own words, where you've actually had to join the dots in quite a few places, that had he not undertaken this project now, that this was going to be lost forever. And I can reflect on this, having stayed in Cape Town for about 8 years, alhamdulillah, and visiting all of the Kramats, we call them mazars in Durban. Being filled with wonder, and the books that were published before didn't really quite do justice to that thirst of wanting to know what these personalities were about. So my first response when Dr. Manjar gave me the book and told me I needed to read it by Friday, that was earlier this week, was, yo, that book is big. So I apologize for having speed read it. But I must say, rather than, I expected my primary or my overwhelming response was going to be an enchantment with the biographies of the awliyāঃ, the mythology coming to life. I was actually more fascinated as the academic part in me of the scholarly endeavor of having to go through so many archives and piece through so much of information and mesh together the oral reports and the anecdotal stuff, as you're saying, and the archival information. So I was really fascinated with that more than anything. But my fascination aside, I think this book comes at a very critical juncture, because with the expansion of the global village, there's a phenomenon of people having lost their cultural identity. And in general, you'll find a lot of people that have become apologetic about anything that doesn't fit in with Western norms, with secular ideas. And so to people like that, this book restores a sense of dignity and identity. Furthermore, with the explosion of the internet and the propagation of ideas that's now been unprecedented, minority groups, and this isn't a new phenomenon, people have been doing this for hundreds of years, but now suddenly minority groups have this big bullhorn called the internet and social media, where they get to accelerate this process of steamrolling other ideologies and browbeating others into a sense of inferiority and submission under the banner of shirk and kufr and bid'ah. And to those people, if anyone's been for Umrah recently, you'll know what I'm talking about. To those people, this book restores a sense of validation, I would say, for lack of a better word. But most importantly for me, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in his difficult times, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَقُلًّا نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ مِنْ أَنْبَاءِ الرُّسُلِ مَا نُثَبِّتُ بِهِ فُؤَادَكَ. That we have mentioned to you all of these narrations of all of the prophets, Ya Rasulullah, for strengthening of your heart. And reading these accounts of these awliyāʼ and the really, really difficult times that they went through, reminds me that, okay, we look around, times are really tough, that the ummah has gone through tough times before, that these tough times affected the best of people, that they responded with sabrun jameel, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eventually gave them victory, even though they didn't see it in their lifetimes. So to me personally, the book gives me a sense of hope, that there is this divine hand that, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can see a pattern. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared the people of the Cape from the time of Sheikh Yusuf as if he laid the groundwork. Then after that, those that came after him built on what he had already advanced. That divine hand has never stopped steering the ummah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Brother Shafiq, if I may start with the first question. Sure. How would you advise that modern Sufi groups, which can sometimes often be pacifist, imbibe these principles of activism that were embodied in the awliyāʼ of yesteryear?
I hope you don't mind if I sit.
Can everybody if I sit?
Okay. Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Okay, I've been denied permission to sit.
Okay, now it's on. Right. That's a very relevant question, because an accusation that has often been hurled at Sufis is, why do you sit in a cave looking at your navel all day long? I haven't seen any Sufis doing that, by the way, but nonetheless, that is the stereotype that we are confronted with. I mean, the irony in terms of answering that question is that every single one of the people I've written about, and I don't think they are exceptions in any way to the pattern of who people of saints, is that all of them had certain characteristics. Number one, they were courageous. Number two, all of them were extremely hard-working. They never gave up. And if you look at the programs that these people put themselves through, it's absolutely amazing. But their focus was always trying to improve people around them, and they were all of them were educators. I mean, Tuan Guru realized that education was the way to freedom. Sheikh Muhammad Saleh Hendricks, who's in the book, actually said that the education of women after slavery was the best form of liberation for women, because they had been neglected so much at the Cape. And if you look at Sufi sheikhs historically, Imam Shamil of Chechnya, buried in Medina, he fought the Russians for nearly 25 years, and he never gave up. What about Imam Muhtar in North Africa? Also. And when you start to think about this, you realize, but hang on a minute, these Sufis are activists. You know, they are all activists. But somehow the narrative I don't know where, I think I do know where it comes from, but you know, those who want to put kufr certificates on our study walls need to take a step back and realize that if it was not for these people, none of us would be sitting here today. Because people of faith don't respond to literalism. People want their lives to be metaphorical because that's what they are. Spirituality is metaphorical. It's real, yes, but it's understood independently by every single human being. If something were to happen here spiritually, everybody would have a different version of it, and each person's version would be as valid as the next person. So my answer to anybody is, if you look at the Sufi sheikhs historically, seriously, they were the activists. They were the people that kept us together.
But I think the question is asked to you. Modern Sufism is political quietism.
Absolutely.
They've abandoned liberation theology. They're not part of the resistance at the moment. They've become the opium of the people. What's your response to that?
Look, I mean, I personally do have problems with that. I mean, if you're a moral human being, how can you say, go make your dhikr and don't worry about those people being genocided? That's a contradiction in terms. And I think this is a challenge. I don't have the answer to it. But if somebody says that they are spiritual or a spiritual leader, they have to be a moral leader as well. And if you're a moral leader, you have to realize what's happening around you. That there is a lot of evil in the world today, and we can't ignore it. As simple as that. And then, as I just already said, in a very long-winded way, the traditional Sufi sheikhs did not ignore these things. It's not in their nature.
I think there's a bigger problem here as well, is that some of the global Sufis, use a verse of the Quran, that you obey Allah, the Prophet and then those who are in authority amongst you. And they use that particular verse for political quietism. And we know there's often, complicity from many of these Sufi groups as far as the resistance is concerned.
Yeah, no, we have, well, I mean, you can isolate this to, I would say, the Middle East, to a lot of Arab countries. My response to that is Arabs are not the majority of Muslims in the Muslim world. The majority of Muslims come from Indonesia and India. I mean, that's nearly 300 million already, and counting. So I think we have to be careful how we sort of look at it, but it is a very valid point, because quietism, there's no excuse for it. And by the same token, you see lots of other religious leaders who may not be followers of Tasawwuf also, particularly legal scholars, also kind of taking the easy route, the petrodollar route, as they say in the classics.
Brother Shafiq, if I may ask another question. I've also found refreshing, I can appreciate that you spent a great deal of time with Sheikh Siraj Hendricks, which alhamdulillah we were quite lucky to study under as well in our time at Medina Institute. There was one part, I actually almost felt him jumping out of the page where you say, the Sufi is a child of the moment. You really love to say that. Dr. Zermanon was speaking about as well. So you quote him in quite a few places, but you're also not afraid to disagree with him, which I find very refreshing. And you would have absolutely loved that, which speaks volumes about him and his pedagogy and the school he sort of taught. I'm sure that in trying to bring all of these, the different narratives together, like you said, the anecdotal as well as those that you found in the reports and all of that you encountered some dissonance. How did you resolve that?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, the late Sheikh Siraj Hendricks was not only a family member, but one of my closest friends. And we used to, I'll give you an example of the kind of arguments we used to have, because friends do argue. We were talking one day about alcohol, thick terms, and he said, no, if a chef put alcohol into the frying pan, he's not going to eat the chicken. I said, no, I'm going to eat the chicken because the alcohol actually evaporates. And he just burst out laughing and he left it there at that point. That was sort of arguments, discussions we would have. But certainly one person that I miss a tremendous amount. In fact, I would like to think he would have been excited about this project, and he probably would have corrected me 101 times in the process. Dealing with dissonance, I mean, as a journalist, you're dealing with dissonance all the time. And the best way of dealing with it, I think, is just to put it on the page and present it in a nice, gentle way and let the reader decide. Because I'm not the judge, I'm not the jury.
Like where you say, none of this adds up.
Yes. Yeah. Indeed. Our maths is bad anyway.
Lovely. Apart from that, and you resolving that dissonance, you obviously garnered quite a lot of criticism as well. How do you deal with that? And this is more, how do I put it? It's a character type of question.
Yeah, at the first book launch, there was an individual who stood up with a sheaf of papers, and he said, Shafiq Morton said this. And he wanted to discredit me at the book launch. I don't mind it. I mean, I have to have a thick enough skin to be able to withstand things, and criticism is normal. Unfortunately for him, the room shut him down very quickly. He was sent packing. But the funny thing is, the people who I expected to criticize me so far have been silent. Maybe I'm waiting for the tsunami. It hasn't occurred yet. There have been no more Kufa certificates have arrived in the post. So I don't know.
It's emailed out to you.
Email, yeah. Oh, yeah. But I mean, on a more serious note, I mean, anybody is welcome to disagree with me, and I'd be very excited if you've got something that adds to what I've said, or even better, because this is just the beginning. I'm human, and I have made mistakes. We have to be honest about it. I mean, none of us perfection doesn't belong to us as human beings, that's for sure. This is just a very humble effort to pen a narrative and hopefully to keep some of our history alive in a very small way.
My last question before we open up to the floor, if you don't mind. Of the many things that this book has to offer, what do you most want young people to take out from it?
I want young people to know who they are, because it's such a cliche, but if we don't know who we are, where are we going? And I'll give you a very graphic example of what I mean by this. About 100 years ago, just after Van Riebeck fell off the ship, I used to teach, and I was teaching in a township school in the Cape Flats in a place called Lavender Hill. This was a people who they'd been absolutely hammered by the Group Areas Act. They'd been removed from District 6, and the streets where they were living in were all named after District 6. It was such an insult. It was so dehumanizing. And this was in the 70s, which gives away a few years. And one of the learners got up and said, you know, why are you talking to us like this? I'm going to be I know I'm a nothing, I'm going to be a nothing. I went, wow. And I thought, okay, Shafiq, you're in trouble here. I said, okay. I said, do you people realize that some of you could be the descendants of Indonesian royalty? And I saw everybody sat by the class, and I said, yes, none of you know where you come from. Some of you could be princes and princesses. And after that, the whole classroom changed. Just on that. And all those years ago, I realized that it's our duty as the older generation to give young people their identity. It's something to be proud of, and there's lots to be proud of. Everybody sitting here has got a crazy, magnificent, beautiful story of how they arrived here in South Africa, how they were born, who their fathers, their mothers, and their descendants were. There's a lot of history here, and it's our turn to tell our histories. If you came from Britain, you can go and shut up. Sorry to anybody who came from there.
Questions from the floor?
Indeed.
I'm looking forward to reading your book. I haven't read it yet. I heard your radio was asked more. Two questions, if I may.
I'll try and remember them.
One is, in your view, do you draw a distinction between the sheikhs of today and the alims or the sheikhs or the Sufi sheikhs that you write about? I think for us, you do make that distinction. I would like to know what that distinction is. So that's the first question. And the second one is, on the talk show, you spoke about a spiritual vision, and you gave the narration of the women who were making zikr in the cellar and crying. I would just like for you to expand on what you meant by the spiritual vision.
Right.
Yeah, one of the sad things of the modern age, or whatever you want to call it, and of the Muslim Ummah, is the damage that has been done by theological literalism and an insecurity of being. In the slightly older days, Tasawwuf was a part of mainstream. Tasawwuf is a science. Any scholar will tell you that. It's a science of the heart. And how can you define Tasawwuf? You get Sharia, Tariqah, and Ma'arifah. That's the one way of describing it. It's based in Sharia. And you will find that most Qadis, legal scholars in the past, were all practitioners of Tasawwuf, albeit in private or sometimes even in secret. I mean, I think it's Ibn Rushd, I'm not too sure, regarded as a controversial figure, but somebody in the time of Andalus remembers going past his house at night, and the man was standing up in the middle of the night reciting Quran and crying. Okay? Somebody who modern day people regard him as very literalist. No, not at all. I'm just using that as an anecdotal example of people practicing spirituality in private. And spirituality was mainstream. Everybody had a sheikh in those days. What was your second question? I forgot. The vision. This takes me into what some people would regard controversial territory. But over the years, I've learned to have to trust it. There are people who can see things. There's some people who see things that they shouldn't see, and those are people you must avoid. Because they talk nonsense, and they're pretending that they're seeing things. And the irony of this situation is that some of the people who've seen us as Muslims the clearest in terms of what's on the other side of the veil are non-Muslim people, or people who are not Muslim, because they see things in a very naive sense and they're very honest with what they see. You know, we've already got a world view, so whatever we see is going to be colored by our own prejudices. The vision I'm referring to, this was a Christian lady who was renting a cottage in Constantia. She was unmarried, but her boyfriend stayed in this cottage, and she could see. And this particular lady, to give you the background, came to see Sheikh Siraj. And he told me the story a number of times because he was so taken aback by it. He vouched for its integrity. He's an expert in Sharia and also in spiritual matters. My current wife was also a witness to this person testifying to what they saw. So that's the background. To me, that's fairly solid. What this lady saw was a figure in a thobe and what in Afrikaans we call it a woelsel, a turban or something, coming into the cottage and greeting her. And she says to the boyfriend, "Why aren't you greeting the stranger?" And the boyfriend says, "What are you talking about? I can't see anybody." Then this girl realizes that she's seeing something. And this sheikh or person tells her, "Do not sleep in this cottage because it's haram." Interesting. He also points to a rose bush outside, and we still haven't been able to work out the significance of that, because people from the other side, as it were, talk with symbols. They communicate via symbols. So, I mean, there was one person who was in the royal family, and he showed that person a crown to say this was my position. But in this scenario, the woman sees the man, he disappears. He appears again another time, what I can remember, and she is led in the cottage downstairs. Now this is vision, trance, dream, whatever state you like to say, because this person has now been allowed to see beyond the veil. This is quite deep stuff. Remember, the barzakh, which is the intermediate realm after a person dies, is very close to us. It's the only way I can explain it. It's close. I'm not going to go any further, otherwise another Kufa certificate will be on its way. But nonetheless, she's led down this passage, and she comes and she finds a circle of women dressed in white making a dhikr. Sheikh Siraj identified the dhikr as being Naqshbandi. But the women are all crying. And what happens is this lady asks the one woman, it's obviously telepathic, why are you crying? And this woman says, we were on the beach of our island with our children and our families, and these strangers came in these boats and they captured us, took us on these boats, and we were taken on these slave ships to Africa. Many people died. Families were split up. We lost our children. Our parents were cut off from us. Our husbands were sold as slaves. And it's a very heart-rending story. And the story goes further, because what happens is she's led down a tunnel. And this person tells us that all the awliyāʼ at the Cape are joined together by these tunnels. Now this again is symbolic. It's telling us that they're all linked. But then she is led in a tunnel all the way to a place which she just says is Turkey, where she sees domes of color. Fayruz is the Arabic. What's the color? It's a bluish color. Turquoise. And it's apparently in Turkey. I do some research, and this is how you connect the dots. What color is the dome of Imam Jalaluddin Rumi's mosque? Turquoise. Where did Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar study before he ended his studies? Anatolia. Who did he get ijazah from? From somebody called Chelebi, who was from the line of Imam Jalaluddin Rumi. He gets an ijazah from Imam Jalaluddin Rumi. So my humble conclusion, it's telling us that is Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, I just asked the question, is he the top saint, the top wali of the Cape? You know, the awliyāʼ have different ranks. You get the abdal and the utad, etc. I'm not going to go into that, but it's basically circular. Is Sheikh Yusuf the top of the circle, and then you've got the concentric circles of the different ranks of the awliyāʼ around him? It's an open-ended question to which I do not have the answer, but I felt it was perhaps a good idea to just ask the question. So I don't know whether I've answered your question in any way at all.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm not sure if I have a question. There might be one later, but I got a lot of comments to make. Firstly, it's a great honor just to meet you in person, because we've spoken over the radio and I've been on social media with you, and it's wonderful to see you here in person. And even more wonderful to know that you've produced this book, which, as an educator, a principal of a school, a rector, etc., I find as one of the most useful, wonderful works that we have at present. And I honestly believe, I'm not a salesman, I'm not your agent. I honestly
Got the
believe
job.
that every household should have something like this for their children and their children's children. Because unfortunately, the younger generations are not aware of our history, our background, and what we went through. You know, if you go back a couple of 100 years, the slaves, the political prisoners, the harassment, virtual torture, their suffering was the basis of what became our people that developed over centuries. And we need to be aware that we have inherited a proud, courageous, and hard-working, leaders who have inspired us over centuries. Even if attempts were made to erase their contribution, it's there. And it's an incredible part of our history, an absolutely incredible part, and we need to be aware of it. I am particularly proud to be the descendant of Indonesian grandparents. My grandfather and his brother came to South Africa in 1870 to mine for diamonds. But the Indonesian roots and the connection goes back even before the time of Van Riebeeck, even before that. So this is an essential part of our youth education and to be aware of this culture, etc. However, it is only a basis from which we need to expand. Because from realizing what we've contributed, we then begin to realize the contribution we've made to South Africa as a country. And that is often ignored or shunted aside. We have built this country. We have built this country. The success of the country as it is today, even despite all the setbacks, was built on the blood and tears and the toil of our forefathers. And we need to recognize that. From that, we will then progress onto the wider issues, which is the international issue. If we do not align ourselves with the international ummah, then we would be failing. We would actually be failing in claiming that we are Muslim. The broad attack on Islam today is an international thing. Gaza is not an isolated little place where war is taking place. Lebanon is not a little place. Tehran and Iran are not countries that are being attacked. The whole Muslim ummah is being attacked. And we need to recognize the fact that at the end of the day, it is the masses of the ummah, Muslims, who need to get things sorted out. I have very little faith in these so-called leaders, political leaders, etc. And after the horrendous sellout of the sheikhs and the princes and the kings and the presidents of Muslim countries, the only glowing thing in that darkness is the fact that the people, the ummah, are beginning to realize that they are being sold out by the leadership. And we can see it clearly. So at the end of the day, it is the international ummah that needs to be sustained, that needs to be enlightened, that needs to know where they, and this book sort of helps in those steps towards the higher priority, which is an international priority. We are not merely South Africans. We are Muslims of the entire world, and in saying we are Muslims, we are saying we are here for the whole of humanity. That is what we are about. I am absolutely thrilled that you are here today and you've given a rather short discourse, I might say, about your book, but it certainly, I think, has given us inspiration to realize that the path forward may be difficult, but the objectives and the ultimate aim, which is enshrined in Islam, are achievable, and it's up to us as individuals to do our best. Thanks.
Any other?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Shafiq, jazakallah for the wonderful intro into your book. It's something that's quite close to our hearts in terms of those who have lived in Cape Town, and definitely we feel that protection that's around the city. A few things, just a few comments, and then I just have one or two questions I wanted to ask you. The part where you said about being treated as human beings and where might is right, which is kind of one of the benchmarks of the colonial era, and I think more and more it's a benchmark. It's quite obvious now. I think sometimes it goes beyond that, and just apologize for the way it's white is right, in the sense that if you're not of a certain lineage and stuff, the dehumanization that takes place is unfortunately where is the obvious starting point, obvious principle, and then genocide and ethnic cleansing is the obvious end point. Actually, it can't go anywhere else if that's how we're going to do it. And I think spending some time in the developed world, even working within the professional setup, it's very, very obvious that it's entrenched in the mindsets, unfortunately, without people even being aware of it. And I'll never forget, about 3-4 years ago, I was sitting in one of the biggest hospitals in Europe and speaking to the oversight committee of the ethics and stuff like that in an auditorium full of immigrants, doctors, and telling them, for God's sake, can you not just treat us like human beings? That's what I literally told them. Forget treating us as, because most of the guys, they were post specialists and whatever it is, but can you just treat us like human beings? And the response was, well, we've heard this before. That was the response. The lady at the end actually burst out in tears afterwards and apologized to us and whatever it was, but yeah. So that really kind of summed up where we are, and I think that's an ongoing issue at the moment, and that's where really Islam comes to liberate us. And at this point, I personally, and I think I have no inferiority complex actually at all in terms of where I am right now, being a person of Africa. I think I feel very privileged and honored actually to be that way. So that's the one thing I wanted to say. What I wanted to ask you in terms of looking at this history, seeing where we come from, and now going forward, looking forward. I was in Cape Town over a period of about 15 to 20 years probably. Where do you see Cape Town now, where we are at the moment, from a Islamic and societal point of view? Because in general the society is changing, there's a big influx there, but in terms of from an Islamic point of view, and one benchmark I think about, I remember Oval Mosque about 15, 20 years ago, before Sheikh Ismail Lawrence and them were there. I remember how it looked, I remember how it felt, I remember there was no set imam, I think, at that stage and stuff like that. And I remember when Sheikh Ismail came in and what happened and the transformation, we literally witnessed it. So as a community, where are we going? Where are we at the moment from an Islamic point of view within the Cape Townian community and the greater South African community? And where do you think the things that we need to work on going forward, especially the youngsters and ourselves as well? So that's what I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, very relevant questions. I'll give you an answer to the whole dehumanization thing. It's a little off topic, but I think it's relevant. Okay, the white tribe is dying out, by the way. This is why America is in the state that it is today. Trump is the last hurrah. If you look at all the demographic studies, the United States is going to be a majority of minorities very soon. So the poor white dude is feeling the pressure. In terms of our humanity, I remember many years ago, okay, this is still working now, I was in Somalia, and Dr. Ahmed, he was also with us, Dr. Ahmed Manzura was also in Somalia. Do you remember, I don't know whether you remember, that some of the Somalians said that they liked us as South Africans. And as journalists we said, why? And they said, because you touch us. It's simple, and they were very upset at the way that the sort of European do-gooders, the way that they were being treated. And I experienced this in Niger, in Pakistan, and many other parts of the world. They used to like South Africans because we are a very touchy-feely people. For us it's normal to shake a person's hand, or it's normal for a doctor. I've got a picture of Dr. Ahmed putting his hand on a child's head, which I think says who we are as a people. We have the ability to feel compassion, which I find with certain South Africans does not exist. Particularly with Ernst Roots and his gang, the AfriForum. Those people lack compassion for other South Africans. It's quite obvious, and it's racism, they're blocked by that. In terms of looking at the Cape Town community and the South African Muslim community, there are huge challenges that lie ahead demographically. And what I mean by this is that we've had an influx of foreigners into this country from East Africa, North Africa, lots of African countries. There are lots of people now in the townships becoming Muslim. And we've kind of fallen asleep at the wheel because there is a building resentment amongst indigenous African Muslims. I know that they're being sidelined, but that we're not noticing them. And in that community, and I feel really sad that I have to say that community, there are some very hard hitters. You call these people submarines, you'd be shocked to know in the indigenous African community who's actually Muslim. But we're failing dismally because we are not being inclusive as we should be. We've got a massive Somali community in Cape Town, for example, who are an island unto themselves, which should not be the case. You've got the Senegalese, they've got their own thing that they do. The Zanzibaris, they do their own thing, and it should not be like that. Because they are, and the Pakistanis and the Bangladeshis. I mean, in Cape Town, the Bangladeshi community had a function at Al-Quds Mosque. The mosque was overflowing, the fullest it's ever been, from just the Bangladeshi community in Cape Town. Where are these people coming from? Where are they? And why are they not part of our mainstream community? Because what is going to happen is that our grandchildren and our children are going to start marrying these people. That's what's going to happen, it's natural. But I think before that time, we need to do some serious work at integration of different communities, because the demographic of South African Muslim has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, really has. But we can't afford to fall asleep at the wheel, because we have to work together. Because Cape Town, for example, is becoming the capital of neoliberalism, the worst possible kind, where Seapoint Promenade is like becoming a mini Tel Aviv. And I'm saying that in all seriousness. And these people have got a lot of money to create a lot of mischief. I mean, how many people know, for example, that in 2011 SAPAC was formed, South African version of APAC, to promote the Zionist interests. So lots of I mean, I'm not overwhelmed by the challenge, because I think we have to meet it. And if we're optimists, we do things, but I think we have to start doing things now before it might get too late. Because we are the people who could do us so much to stop xenophobia. Our community, we have the power to stop xenophobia in its tracks. Because if we become a fully integrated community, the xenophobes are not going to have any space to move. That's just my personal view.
Any other question? Hand over to the Mr. Chairman.
Jazakallah. Thank you very much, Shafiq Morton, for that exposition, and that brings us to the conclusion of this event. Before I ask Sheikh to conclude with the dua, I wish to offer my sincere thanks and appreciation to all of you for accepting our invitation and being here today. Also wish to thank Fatima from our office and Tazkiyah and Dr. Manjra for supporting OCAF in this initiative. I want to thank Shafiq. I know at very short notice got a call from our Cape Town office inviting him over to Durban, and within a very short time you've been here. And thank you very much for gracing us with your presence. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here. And I also want to acknowledge sort of the foresight of the Board of Trustees at OCAF for having commissioned such a book. And like I said in my introduction, this is the 40th one in a series of books. And we have all the proceeds from the sale of these books go back into our Waqf fund. It generates more money for us to print more books on more relevant topics to sort of record the history of the Muslim contribution in this country. I'm not sure how many of you know that in the school curriculum currently, the entire history curriculum is being rewritten. And we had opportunity as the community or the public to make an input to the government in terms of what's now being proposed as the new history curriculum. And you know, when it comes into the school curriculum, that is what the community is going to be fed. And they could easily leave out certain things and prioritize a different narrative. And if we as a community, we have the opportunity, because there's an open opportunity to make submissions, and civil society, and I know even through the Association of Muslim Schools, we've made submissions, and we need to take up with courage these opportunities and make sure that we don't fall by the wayside. Therefore, the message about the courage of our leaders and the community needs to be upfront to protect us, inshallah. I thank you again for accepting our invitation and for the support you've shown to our work. Thank you very much. Is Sheikh Hafiz up to conclude with the dua, inshallah? And then when we finish, please do join us for some tea and snacks at the back. Books are for sale at the back there, and Brother Shafiq's happy to sign a book if you bought one, inshallah.
اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد في الأولين، وصل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد في الآخرين، وصل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد في الملأ الأعلى إلى يوم الدين. اللهم هيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا، اللهم هيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا، اللهم هيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا، اللهم احفظنا بعينك التي لا تنام، واكنفنا بكنفك الذي لا يرام، اللهم احفظنا من كل بلاء الدنيا وعذاب الآخرة يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم إنا نسألك من كل خير سألك منه عبدك نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، ونعوذ بك من كل ما استعاذك منه عبدك نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.